Today I'm sharing how I turned this old dresser into a bathroom vanity with the vessel sink in another episode of my bathroom makeover on a budget series. I found this dresser on Facebook Marketplace for $150. It was the perfect size for this bathroom and in good condition but needed to be refinished. I removed the old drawer pulls, then using a bowl and a paintbrush, applied a thick layer of citrus strip to the entire surface of the dresser and the face of the drawers. I left it to sit for about 30 minutes, checked a corner of the dresser to see if it was ready, then took a plastic putty knife and scraped off the varnish. After scraping, I used mineral spirits and a rag to thoroughly clean the dresser and drawers, removing any residue left over from the citrus strip. Once the dresser was dry, I used my orbital sander and a fine grit sandpaper to remove the remaining stain. Then I used an extra fine grit to get a smooth finish while being careful to not sand away the wood grain texture. After sanding, I wiped the dresser down with a tack cloth to remove the dust. I used all water-based Behr products that won't yellow over time to refinish the dresser. Using a rag, I applied a coat of wood conditioner, then let that sit for 5 minutes before wiping it off and applying the first coat of stain in the color Early American. I wiped off the excess stain, let it dry, then repeat those steps until I had the color I was going for, which took a total of 3 coats. After the third coat dried, I used a paintbrush to apply 3 coats of a satin clear polyurethane, letting each coat dry in between. After the polyurethane cured for 3 days, I moved the dresser into the bathroom. I pulled out the drawers, set them aside, and removed the wheels from the legs of the dresser. To make room for the drain and the water lines, I removed the strip of wood from the middle of the dresser, then used my jigsaw to cut a larger opening, which didn't turn out pretty, but no one will see the back of the vanity when it's done. Before installing the vessel sink, we needed to drill 2 holes into the countertop for the drain and the water lines. For the drain, we're using a 2 1/4 inch hole saw, which is just big enough to fit the drain and its components. For the water lines, we went with the 1 1/2 inch hole saw, making the hole slightly larger than needed for the lines to fit through. I wanted the sink to be centered on the vanity, which is 40 inches wide, making the center point 20 inches. We lined up the speed square in the center of the vanity and traced the line with the pencil. Next, we marked the line 7 1/2 inches from the back of the counter where the center of the drain will be, then measured back 4 1/2 inches and marked the center of the hole for the water lines. We drilled pilot holes where we had marked the center point of each hole, then placed the sink on top of the counter to make sure the pilot holes were properly spaced and where we needed them. Using the pilot hole as a guide, we drilled the drain hole first using the 2 1/4 inch hole saw, then did the same thing for the water line hole using the 1 1/2 inch hole saw. With the holes drilled, we dry fit the sink, drain, and faucets to make sure everything fit, then set it all aside so we could get the wastewater pipe prepped before installing. We used a saw to cut off the old plumbing, leaving enough of the wastewater pipe sticking out to adhere the new 1 1/2 inch adapter to. Then we primed the wastewater pipe and the adapter before using PVC cement to adhere the two together. Next, I installed the drain and faucet before setting the sink in place. I removed the tailpipe, lock nut, and both washers from the drain and set them aside. I ran a bead of clear all-purpose waterproof sealant around the underside of the drain flange, placed the drain into the opening, then placed the drain washer, friction washer, and nut onto the body. I tightened the nut down by hand, making sure it was snug, but not so tight that it could crack or damage the sink. Then I flipped the sink on its side and cleaned up any sealant residue that had squished out from the sides of the drain. To install the faucet, I removed the lock nuts and washers from the bottom of the faucet, leaving the rubber flange in place, then inserting the faucet through the hole in the sink. I placed the rubber and metal washer back in place, threaded the lock nuts onto the bolts, then held the sink up on its side to make sure the faucet was lined up straight on the sink before tightening the lock nuts down the rest of the way. To hold the sink in place, I used the same all-purpose waterproof sealant, running beads along the raised edges on the bottom of the sink where it'll make contact with the countertop. I lifted the sink, pushed the water lines through the back hole, then carefully lined up the drain with its hole before setting the sink down in place and making sure it was sitting straight on the vanity. With the sink in place, I reattached the tailpipe to the drain, although I forgot to use seal tape, which I realized later on. I ran across this system called Simple Drain and decided to give it a try. It comes with a 30-inch rubber hose, clamp, trap loop, threaded fitting, and a 1¼ inch waist adapter. One end of the hose is longer than the other and goes over the drain tailpipe. I placed the clamp around the hose and slid the hose over the tailpipe. The first half of the hose end fits 1½ inch tailpipes, and the second half narrows to fit 1¼ inch tailpipes, which is what I have. I fit the narrow end of the hose all the way onto the tailpipe, then tightened the clamp down, securing the hose in place. To create the P-trap, you install the trap loop level with the bottom of the wastewater pipe, leaving a 2 to 4 inch loop in the hose. With the trap loop in place, bend the other end of the hose, figure out where it should connect to the wastewater pipe. Then, using a pair of scissors, cut the tube in between two of the ribs, but leave it a little longer than you think you'll need. You can always cut more off if it's too long. Pop the end of the hose into the 1½ inch threaded fitting, then tighten it down over the wastewater adapter. If you have a 1¼ inch wastewater adapter, then you'll attach the 1½ to 1¼ inch adapter that's included in the kit before attaching the threaded fitting to the adapter. To connect the water lines, make sure you connect the supply line labeled hot to the hot water supply valve and the other supply line to the cold water supply valve. Thread the nut onto the outlet by hand, then tighten it down with a wrench, making sure not to over tighten it. With your faucet in the off position, open your hot and cold water valves and check for leaks. Turn the faucet on, let it run for a minute to flush out any debris, and check your drain for leaks. The tailpipe wasn't visibly dripping, but I could tell it felt wet to the touch. This is when I realized I'd forgotten to use the seal tape. I loosened the clamp, removed the tube, unscrewed the tailpipe, and dried it off before wrapping the thread end in seal tape, screwing it back in place, then reattaching the hose and tightening the clamp back down. This fixed the problem, and after turning the water back on, I didn't find any other leaks. With the plumbing done, I finished off the sink by running a bead of the same waterproof sealant around the bottom, then smoothing it out with my finger. For the drawers to fit around the plumbing, I modified the boxes from a square to a U shape. The bottom drawer was fine, except for the back of the drawer where the P-trap hangs down, so using a speed square, I drew an outline slightly lower and slightly wider than the space needed for the P-trap to clear the back of the drawer. The middle drawer needed to fit around the water lines, valves, and the drain hose. I found the widest points of plumbing on each side where the water valves were, then I marked those points on the back of the drawer. Next, I slid the drawer as far into the vanity as it could go without hitting the plumbing, then measured how far the drawer was sticking out from the face of the vanity, which was 7¼ inches. I took that measurement and transferred it to the bottom of the drawer, drawing two lines 7¼ inches long, then connected those lines, giving me the shape needed to fit the plumbing. I then repeated those steps with the top drawer. To cut the drawers out, I used a 3/4 inch spade drill bit and a jigsaw. I used the bit to drill holes in the corners of the outline, then used the jigsaw to cut along the straight lines. After cutting out the U-shape, I used 1/4 inch thick wood to box in the drawers. I added the sides of the U-shape first, leaving the wood 1/4 inch longer than the cutout so that the middle piece could fit in between the two sides at the bottom of the U-shape. I ran glue along the bottom and the side of the wood, clamped it in place, then used a nail gun to secure it to the back of the drawer. For the middle piece, I cut the wood to fit in between the sides, ran wood glue along the edges, then used the nail gun to secure it in place. I flipped the drawer over and ran a 1½ inch by 1/4 inch strip across the underside of the drawer for additional support. I ran a bead of wood glue along the board, pressed it in place, then nailed through the sides of the drawer into the board. I also nailed through the support board and the bottom of the drawer into the middle piece of the drawer box. This This helped to secure the new drawer box to the bottom of the drawer, and the support board will help keep the drawers from bowing over time since I removed part of its support structure when cutting out the U shape. For the final touch, I installed new drawer pulls, completing this vintage dresser turned bathroom vanity. I love the way this turned out, and I'm so excited to share the final reveal of this bathroom makeover with all of you in my next video. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, you can check out the full bathroom makeover on a budget series playlist linked right here.